Thank you for joining today's AMA session. My name is Christina Wood, Director of Start and Scale Programs here at Communitech. And I'm super excited to have Allison, Jim, Martha, and Sheri joining us today to discuss the challenges of employing parents during a pandemic. We'd also like to take this time to talk about some resources that employers can use to navigate this difficult time. So before I turn it over to the panel to further introduce themselves, I have a few housekeeping items that I'd like to share. So just a reminder that this session is being recorded so that we can share it at a later date for folks who are on the call or who missed the call to refer back to. All of our AMA recordings can be found at communitech.ca. I also ask that you keep your microphone on mute during the session, but we do encourage you to ask questions and use the chat functionality to do so. Please feel free to ask questions throughout the conversation and don't feel like you need to hold those until the end of the session. Also, please feel free to connect with any of our panelists on LinkedIn if you would like to ask further questions or engage with them. And we are also hoping to continue this conversation by hosting a similar session for working parents at our Working Parents peer-to-peer. So please watch out for the date to follow and more information on that. And lastly, please check out Your Week in Tech or our Startup and Scale Up newsletters for a list of all of our upcoming AMA sessions. So with that, we'll get started and I will turn it over to our four panelists to introduce themselves. So Allison, if we can start with you, please.
Hi, my name is Allison Venditti. I am founder of Careerlove. I focus on career coaching for women as well as Moms at Work, which is a support and advocacy group for working mothers.
Awesome. Thank you for joining us today. Jim, would you be able to introduce yourself, please? Oh, did we lose Jim? Sheri, can I have you introduce yourself, please?
Hi, I'm Sheri. I'm the founder and chief lizard at Codezilla. We teach kids how to code. And I'm also a parent and a working mom. So I really understand the realities of working parents through a pandemic.
Thank you for being here today. And Martha, can you introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Martha Van Berkel, and I'm the CEO at Schema. I'm also a mom, and I have two kids, 5 and 7, Ruth and Garrick. So I'm responsible not only for kind of making sure the house stuff gets done, but also sort of leading our company through a growth stage. So we're 20 people and in sort of high growth.
Awesome. Thanks for being here. And Jim, if you can introduce yourself.
Take two. My name is Jim Moss, and I'm a husband and a father of 3. I've got a startup and a failed startup, and I'm now the Vice President of Wellbeing at the YMCA in town.
Awesome. Thanks for joining us today. So to kick things off, this conversation, I'd like to turn it over to Martha and talk to us a little bit about your experience as, you said, a mom and an entrepreneur, founder of a growing, scaling organization. Yeah, we'll start with that, and then maybe you can tell us a little bit about what culture was like at Schema app pre-COVID, and then now, moving into September and back to school.
Sure. So what I thought I'd just share of like what sort of life is normally like, and then how that's evolved over time. And then I actually did a quick survey of some of the parents in my office to say, like, what is it that makes us, I will say, family friendly? Not statistically relevant. It was like 3 people, but all good. So prior to COVID, like, as a parent, like I was always constantly juggling, right? So it's this juggle of like, how do I make sure my kids are getting to school and taken care of, which is frankly like #1 priority. How do I make sure I know what's being made for dinner so that we can be fed, while also sort of worrying about our sales pipeline and figuring out who we're going to hire next, and how are we going to hit that growth target that we really want to hit as a bootstrap scale up. And so it's really like juggling all those things is a normal sort of state of being. And I think what happened like during COVID is as a working parent and as a CEO, like my stress sort of like just kept going up. And I also have Lyme disease. So I also like, you know, have to manage my stress regularly just as part of like managing my own health. And so I think what like we all just need to understand is like when COVID hit, it kind of became a shit show. And I just say that because like the stress level that parents and sort of, you know, humans we can maintain is like, you know, we can usually like manage it like a little bit above, but like with COVID, like it just constantly was going up and hitting sort of that ceiling. And I was very fortunate that we had a grade 12 student who I had started babysit after, you know, March break to say like, hey, can you help me out? And then she stayed with us the whole time. So I had 4 days of help. Frankly, those Fridays where I was like juggling parenting and the business and everything was just like not a ton of fun for me. I was like trying to be present to my kids, but like still trying to make things moving. So I think like the first thing is just to appreciate that, like whether you're the CEO or whether you're an individual contributor at the company, like COVID has added that extra stress. And just because kids are sort of, I'll say back to school, because my kids aren't in school today, is that like, it's actually like that stress is continuing through this month. You know, my kids go to school tomorrow, first full-time day, and they're supposed to like keep going, but like they're super stressed normally going back to school. So it's normally a stressful time for parents. And now they have to wear masks and they like can't see their teachers' faces. And there's all this added stress. So I would say like, you know, the COVID shit show continues, and that like parents are going to continue to have this bobble up, and I think that's like the culture here hasn't changed. I think perhaps because I don't know, like I've worked at big companies and for other companies where like the human aspect is so important. And so before COVID and during COVID, like we asked this question during ones on questions like, how is your head and how is your heart? And we ask the heart question because like we actually want to understand how the whole person is doing. And that means saying, you know, if you don't have kids, also sharing those stresses. But if you do have children, you know, during COVID, it was like, I have no care and I can't focus at all of my day. So like, I'm going to have to start working at these different times, and us having an understanding that like things are going to have to be flexible, that we like being empathetic is actually something that people want in a company. And I think this isn't just like for parents. I think it goes more broadly than that. And so when I asked, you know, the parents in the office, like, you know, what do we do at Schema app that you think supports you as a parent? They were saying like just being empathetic, you know, being understanding that there's going to be some days that like, you know, normal world, like my kid's sick, I've got to take them to the doctor immediately. They have an ear infection, like to figure out what's going on. Or I didn't sleep halfway through the night because my kid still gets up twice in the week because we just moved apartments and doesn't know where it is. So like, there's just like constant things, and that's just elevated. They also said that like, I trust them to like do the right thing and make up the time. So if they need to do a parenting duty, that like, I trust them enough that they're going to still get their work done and find time to do that work. And then the other thing that they talked about was that I actually care and want to know about their family. And so, you know, it's not just how are you doing? Okay, quickly move on to the next thing. It's like, how are you actually doing? And, you know, if someone shares something that's like going on with their family, like I actually care and I'm concerned for them. And I'm concerned not just about my bottom line, but I'm actually like really, truly concerned about them. And then I guess the last piece is, you know, really just focusing on the fact that like these parents, like they're not only looking after themselves and about their role, but they have like these other things going on, you know, keeping other humans alive, which is, I would say, like of their utmost concern. And so just like remember that when you're having conversations and ask the like why and want to hear what it is. So I guess like that would say like it hasn't changed here at Schema App because that's sort of how we operate. And just like my team's been understanding these 2 weeks where I've been working 11 to 6 instead of my normal day. Christine, does that cover it for you? That's sort of, yeah. That would be my like intro to be like, just breathe. And a bit of the reality that like I'm currently living through. And I don't think it's over yet. I guess is part of my point also to other leaders.
Okay, thanks for sharing that, Martha. So you would say that you know, being empathetic and a trusting workplace and truly caring has you know, always been there as a theme and has continued with COVID. And so there isn't actually any new policies or procedures you've put into place as a result.
There is one policy. So we actually have become more flexible with regards to work from home. So, I think that's sort of a given for everyone, but even as things evolve, so we actually have more people in the office today as we normally do. But, for parents who it's like, oh, actually, especially this week, I need to be home working from home because I have kids at home. We've updated our policies to be more flexible with that, both as a result of the pandemic and also as a result of just, again, trying to be understanding and accommodating, so that, it's a win for both.
Great. Thanks for sharing that. Jim, I'd love to turn it over to you and hear a little bit about some of the research and data that you're collecting and how that supports what Martha's experiencing.
So thank you, first of all. And Martha, thanks for sharing. I'm about to make you look like a genius, whether your survey was statistically relevant or not. The things that Martha suggested are really bang on. And I'm going to show a little bit of data. We just recently, so our approach to well-being is to always collect data first, understand what we're really working with, and try to identify what are the things that we can be doing about it in the most prioritized way. So we obviously can't do everything. So if we can only do one or a few things, what is it that people need the most, and how do we need to think differently about different groups of people within our organizations? Mackenzie, would you pop up the first chart there about workplace well-being and parents? All right, so here's a breakout of some data we collected in July and early August, and we've broken it out to compare working parents and non-working parents and how their well-being, how they're reporting their well-being. And then in the bottom half there, we've actually broken it out into different types, different groups of parenting conditions. So what I would love you to notice there is, first of all, there is about a 5% difference, which is statistically quite significant, between working parents and working non-parents, which means that overall, in terms of the entire group, there are about 5% fewer people who are reporting healthy levels of well-being, and there are about 5% more people reporting unhealthy levels, and that's in the total aggregate. But more importantly, if you look down at the bottom there, you'll see the dark bars on the left side represent the number of people who are reporting unhealthy levels of well-being. And the orange bars on the far right are the percentage of people who report healthy, so above average, but significantly healthy well-being. In those 5 bottom layers, you'll notice that 4 out of those 5 groups represent people living with children. So either single or married and living with children, parents, the parents that we're talking about. And if you look at the bottom 2 levels there, the single women with no children, the single father with children, only 13% of those people are reporting levels of adequate or above average health. And we've got 58 and 63% of people reporting themselves, self-reporting as being unhealthy. Married with children, married father with children, still 44 and 46% of people. That's almost half of those groups are reporting unhealthy state of general well-being in the context of the workplace. So what can we do about this? I mean, it's not probably, I don't look like a genius, or it's not rocket science to suggest that parents are being impacted differentially than the average employee. But what can we do about it? Mackenzie, would you switch over to the needs analysis? Perfect. Thank you. So this is where Martha looks like a genius again. So not only did she recognize that parents need different things from her, but also she was able to intuitively understand that it is flexible work arrangements that people are asking for most. So when we asked this group, and it ended up being a little bit less than 1,100 people who are working in our region, 58% of them selected flexible work arrangements as their number one need. And so that is, like, you can see that that's almost 20% higher than everything else that's needed. And so when there is such a period of uncertainty, and whether we have older kids or younger kids, or whether our kids are in school or not, the needs of a parent, if you've hired a parent, you've hired a family. And right now, those needs that parents have include that flexibility and that open-mindedness. So the next two after that are leadership communication and team connection. And those two things just tie into more of our standard or basic needs for a healthy workplace, which is to be connected to our community and to have information from our leadership. In startups and scale-ups, there's probably a really high level of communication between founders and leaders and their teams. And probably the transition to digital meeting spaces was an easier one. And so I really do think that the flexible work arrangements is the one for startups and scale-ups to focus on. Mackenzie, you can switch that off there. I'll look directly into the camera. I want to underline one last theme that Martha brought forward, which I think is critical, and that is the need for empathy and then the need for compassion. So empathy asks us to put ourselves in somebody else's shoes and imagine what they are feeling or thinking or experiencing. And then compassion asks us to change our behaviors with that information in mind. And so as leaders, we need to stop and think about all the different groups that make up the population of our workforce and imagine how they're feeling. Go one step further and actually ask, to inform that insight better. And then think about how you can act differently with that information. And so if you take that and you can imagine that people need that additional flexibility, that feels like the most obvious place where you can extend something that's fundamentally free to you as a leader, but will pay really big dividends for those employees.
Thanks for those insights, Jim. Appreciate that. Allison, I'd like to turn things over to you and have you tell us a little bit about some additional resources that companies can access in order to support parents.
Sure. And I think I'm going to give a little bit of background about what I've been doing for a little bit. So I've been in HR for almost 20 years now. That sounds like a really long time when I say that out loud, but I actually started my HR career during SARS. So this is not my first pandemic as HR. So it's been actually really interesting. So my kids are 9, 7, and 2. I'm self-employed, but I work as a consultant supporting both working parents and as well as organizations. So in terms of resources, the number one thing I hear from small companies is we don't have a lot of money to throw at this, right? What do we do with a lot of money? And I don't know if it's possible to pull up Jim's last slide there about what working parents actually needed, because I think that actually nails it on the head. About all the things that they list don't cost a lot of money, right? They're talking about communication strategies. They don't take a lot of money to implement a lot of these communication strategies. So they want clarification on things like COVID policy. They want clarification on what options are available. So the one thing that I've been doing with some startups and as well as some bigger companies is putting together simple packages for parents and for everybody around free mental health resources. In Canada, we're so lucky. You can get everything from free CBT to, several sessions covered with a psychotherapist. And I can share those resources on where to find them. I got them from my contact at Canadian Mental Health Association, CMHA, sorry. I also do writing for Great West Life Center for Mental Health on how to handle parenting and work. So I can share those resources as well, but there's so many free resources that I will share. But the best thing you can do for your employees is if you have a benefits plan, break it out for them. Tell them we have $500 for therapists. We have $200 for whatever. One of the top things was a work from home station, right? I know several companies have been here's $150 to help you get a new chair, or some right there. See, yeah. They're really small things that don't cost a lot of money that make the biggest impact. And Jim talked about being empathetic and being supportive. But for me, the biggest thing is make the information available and tell them who they need to talk to get the support, so that they're not do I talk to my manager? Do I talk to our HR consultant? Do I go to my founder? Who do I go to? Because they shouldn't have to run around. And this goes across, for a lot of the stuff I do with parents, it goes across all lines. No matter if you have kids or not, I don't know what's going on at home, right? The one thing I will say that has come up a few times is for everybody who's working from home, I want to make people very aware that some people need to come into the office. So they may be in an abusive relationship. They may have other things going on at home. So although usually the push is for like working at home, it's like, can you support your employees if they would need to find a space outside of the home, if that makes sense? And that's something that's come up in a way that I wasn't actually prepared for. So it's not like you have to open up your office again, but I worked with a couple of things where they're like, you know, we have a desk at a co-working space. If anybody needs that, it's there, right? Like no questions asked, just go there if you need it, right? So that's really
Allison,
great.
can I just build on something that you mentioned?
Yeah.
So you talked about sort of like sharing resources,
Right.
and there was something around planning that sort of really triggered an emotional piece in me. Like part of what really pissed me off 2 weeks ago, I think when we were planning this webinar, it was like the school decided to change the plan. Like kids weren't going back to school on the 8th. They were like, they're going to go back to school full time on what's tomorrow? 16th. Like, holy shit, my world just changed. Like my whole calendar was like planned out already for those 2 weeks. And so I think, I guess I'm just reiterating, like anything you can do that sort of helps people anticipate and plan and sort of know that, you know, like the world kind of explodes and gets really bad when like things change, and the schools have been changing the rules like in a week's notice. So I guess that's it. I loved your sort of like send things to help people plan and understand and simplify and quickly digest. I love that. Sorry.
And the one thing I say to companies is like, the one thing I've not seen a lot of is like, we're planning for all these things that are flying at us, but no one really has a lot of planning about what happens if one of your staff gets COVID, right? What happens if my child gets it and now I'm on, like, so those things should be thought about beforehand, because the last thing I want to do is freak out, call you and say, I have COVID, I don't know what to do. You can be like, actually, here's our plan. Here's the person who's going to cover you. Don't worry about it. That's what you should be able to say. Like, work should not be your focus if you get really sick, right? And that's we have those policies in place for all sorts of things. But it's the one thing that's happening fast and furious. And I think people are just so overwhelmed trying to keep up with school, right? Like, or not starting school or starting school or whatever. It's like, what happens if the unexpected happens? What happens if school says your child can't come in for 3 days? Right? Like that's my biggest, like, please, they're going to send them home. So having those kind of conversations up front, and even if you don't have an answer, communicating that and say, we're working on it, right? Like then they say, okay, it's not all on me. They know this might be coming. I don't want to be the bad employee because these things can happen. So those are not
tell you that they're feeling sick, and then right.
Even
and then
worse.
You have a resource like that too. That was like one of the things I thought was really awesome. So you're going to share that, right? On like you called them like emergency plan or something like that.
They call them contingency plans because no one likes emergency, because then it sounds scary. So we call them contingency plans, and it's just usually, especially for small organizations, like say the 5 of us worked at an organization, we would say, okay, if Allison gets sick, Jim already has her stuff ready to go and has access to my email address. And if Martha, Sheri has her stuff, like really simple things, but then no one's freaking out if someone isn't in on Wednesday and they have a client call, right? Like no one's trying to master that stuff. It's like, who's your buddy, basically.
So Allison, I'm just going to build on like our executive team, we actually have like a risk registry that we manage for the business overall. And so I think, you know, one thing I'm going to do is actually revisit that and add in COVID related ones. So we review it on a monthly basis. So I think that's like a really actionable thing that the CEOs can do that sort of ties to something we're already managing. We're expected to do it because of some of our enterprise clients, but it's, you know, really good thing to do that. Again, it's like, and a month comes by really fast that you can add those things on. Yeah, it's great.
Yeah. And those plans should really be like checking them off and rechecking them every like 6 to 8 weeks seems a lot, but it's not if you've already done and you're just reviewing it, right? So it's like a 10-minute review of like, okay, this still looks great, sign it off, don't have to worry about it again, right?
It doesn't need to be the founder, right? You can assign somebody who is well suited to do that,
right?
You know, to be the lead on that, somebody that you believe that people will have the trust in. And even just the process of going through it is letting people feel, instead of guessing how they think you'll react, they're actually hearing how you intend to react. And you can get feedback before you're standing waist deep in the next wave of the shit show as it kind of crashes on the beach.
And that's it. Like Jim hit the nail on the head. It's like, we don't know what's happening the same way you don't know what's happening, but we're here with you and we're trying. That's the best thing an employee says, is like, nobody's expecting you to be perfect in a pandemic, but we're trying and we're keeping you in the loop. That was one of the top things. There are 3 or 4 communication things on Jim's post that was like, we just need to know, right? Like, just tell us. That's so important.
That's so great. I'm gonna pause the conversation there for a second and just reach out to the audience to say, do you have any questions? Please chime in on chat. Or if you are a startup or a scale up who have, implemented something within your company that you think others on the call could benefit from, please feel free to put that into the chat as well. We can all learn best from each other. So what I'm hearing as a summary is that scenario planning and kind of going through those contingency plans is probably a good first step if early stage companies haven't done that already. Allison, did you have any other things that you wanted to touch on with way of resources?
No, I think I'm just going to I've pulled a few different ones specifically around free resources and sort of templates that people can use that I have. Like I said, from CMHA and from Great West Life, and like there's a lot of, and also I can put links to other resources depending on what people need. But like, I want to make that, like, they're simple things, right? These are not complicated HR 20-page resource manuals. It's like a single page of let's fill in who's where and why and how. And I also might look for a really good like communication template for how to communicate new policy, right? Yeah.
That'd be super helpful. Great. So I'll turn the conversation over to Sheri a little bit here. So we've talked about, some of the stressors that parents are experiencing right now that might play out in their performance in the workplace. What are some things that we talked about some things that employers can do to support parents. And Sheri, I'd love to hear from you on some of the resources that you offer to help parents educate kids while at home.
Right, thank you. And I'm going to also follow up with Jim's really excellent slides. And his second slide said that 33% of parents, so 1 in 3 parents, was looking for childcare support, which is really hard when you obviously can't interface. You have to have social distancing. So Codezilla provides after school programs and summer camps. Our 5 summer camp locations, 20 staff, immediately had to pivot online. So it was all online. And I think if you're an employer or a parent looking for online programs for the family, I would approach it with the same questions that a journalist would ask. Who, what, where, when, why. They're not all created equal. I mentioned earlier on when I introduced myself, I'm a parent. I did test out the American platform. We tested out free stuff. You mentioned resources for parents. As a parent, I think I was inundated with resources. You go on every Facebook page, there were free resources, videos, YouTube. I mean, honestly, it was really stressful because you felt you had to educate, parent and co-teach your child. We kept it really simple. Right now we're having I personally find this a really engaging, informative conversation. I've mentioned it's kind of intimate, you're in my bedroom, which sounds really inappropriate. I've seen kids in their kitchen. And the point is, online learning is not the most horrendous way to learn. Is it the optimal way? No, but I think it's better than staring at a screen. I don't think all screen time is created equal, just like I don't think all foods are created, nutritionally equal. So we really approached it by saying, what are we offering? Online learning for younger kids, older kids, hands-on crafts. Yes, we made slime online. It's possible. Or online coding. How did we do it? We knew that not every family had multiple computers. And moreover, some people have to share the computers. So we would offer coding camp or classes when we thought parents would probably be taking a break. So 11:30 to 12:30 or after hours. We rented computers at really cost-efficient prices. Little things like that made it a lot more family-friendly. You had to really think it through to say, you know what, I'm a working parent. What do my kids need? At the very least, I had my 12-year-old and her 13-year-old friend. They were online teaching crafts to kids. This worked for my teenage daughter. It worked for the younger kids. At the very least, you can get a free Zoom account, hire the babysitter across the street who you normally would hire anyway for date night, get them online and talking to your child. I'm so sorry, one-on-one, because I think there's so many ways you can do this without spending a lot of money, but you still get that childcare support.
What a great resource for if, in a pinch, last minute, even your child is no longer in school for the day, or to help you manage through. So thank you for sharing that. Jim, I wanted to circle back to something you mentioned, maybe it was in our prep call, but you talked about how the tsunami is still coming. So even though we've been dealing with a pandemic, what did you mean by that, and how can companies prepare?
Well, there's a really strong belief out there in the healthcare realm, and what the belief is that the stressor, the primary event was COVID, and the illness of COVID is going to impact however many people, but the disruption to our lives and our economy and our society has created a follow-on, or what they're calling an echo pandemic. And that echo pandemic is really going to be centered around mental health predominantly. And there's we all have this additional capacity, this variable kind of resilience. And part of it is physical resilience in our physical health, but part of it is cognitive resilience as well. And so we can deal with a ton of shit. We really can. We are far more resilient than we tend to believe that we are, until we're tested and we're able to actually see how resilient we are. But given the severity and the duration of COVID, and you'll notice, well, maybe you haven't heard, but they're saying don't expect anything that might be a permanent new normal until January 2022, which means we're still looking at 16 plus months of whatever happens in between, which can be up and down. And our overall resilience is going to start to empty along the way. And as we have these different flare-ups, we may have handled the initial events well, but as we, run out of that cognitive and emotional resilience, we may not respond as well to the flare-ups, or when we have to go back to stage 2, and it's going to feel really difficult. And so we really believe that there is, the metaphor a little bit is the pandemic was an earthquake, and you think you've survived the earthquake, but really you need to be preparing for the tidal wave that's going to hit the shore at some time delay. And
I vomit right now? Like, seriously?
I hate to be the bearer of
Thanks, Jim,
news,
for ruining my day.
The good news is that all the things you've been doing, if you can just keep doing those and maybe get that 5th day covered so that you have the resilience, but it really does mean that we have to be reinvesting in filling our resilience tanks. And that means lightening workloads and adjusting goals and doing things to not think that we're out of the woods yet, because that's when you get blindsided.
So I really mean that. Like, I just, it actually makes me really, like, it hits me at home, because actually my co-founder is my husband, right? So, what a great time to not, like, to be married to your co-founder. Like, seriously, like this, but we've had the conversation around, like, also as founders, right? So our audience is like my peers around, like, scale ups and startups, is like, so it's time to start taking care of ourselves, right? Because, like, you can't take care of your team if you're not taking care of yourself. And so, like, we've actually just, personally tried to just be like, okay, how do we start, like, making sure we're exercising regularly? Or, even if it's like, I rode for 10 minutes this morning, small win, right? But, like, how are we making sure we're going to our doctor's appointments, and, making sure we're doing things for our own mental health? So I guess, like, my first kind of reaction to that is, like, to my peers, like, make sure you're taking care of yourself. Like, what can you change this week that's starting to make sure you're managing your stress? Because I think another joke I shared with the group was that, like, I've never spent so much time wearing my HR hat than I've spent over the last, like, 4 months. And freaking stresses me out. I'm a sales CEO. Like, I want to spend my time selling. Like, that's where I want to spend my time. And so the fact that I've had to rewrite my reopening strategy policy like 4 times, enough already, right? Like, I need to, like, check in, constantly check in with my team, spend more time doing one-on-ones and, like, being a leader before being my salesperson. So for me, it's, like, actually made me have a really big shift. But the other thing is just, like, we are now you know, they're going to start adding like another 5K to our marathon, like every quarter. And so, you know, how do we as leaders start making sure that we're prepping for that? So you know, Jim, I just wanted to echo it. Like, I think as leaders, like we have a especially important piece. And then there's a complication that comes with parents, with people in, you know, high stress situations at home, people who are, you know, Sheri, I want to bring up like Black Lives Matter has added a whole different layer also onto this whole thing, more stress and more, you know, complexity, right? So I guess I'll leave it at that.
Can I say something about the leadership? And it's super important because not only do we have to put our own oxygen masks on first to be healthy, to lead well, we need to do it in the open. And so you need to put time on your calendar that everybody can see that says, I'm going to a doctor's appointment, or I'm going to schedule this time to take a walk. Today, I put on there, it's my kid's first day back in school. From 3:30 to 4:30, I'm unavailable so that I'm fully available for my kids from 3:30 to 4:30. And so as much as I need to be doing that for myself for all the right reasons, I need to demonstrate through my actions the norms and behaviors that my employees also need to have to be healthy. And so, you know, when we do these things for ourselves, but we hide them away, it doesn't create the space or the implicit permission for our teams to behave in the same way and prioritize the things that they need for their own health.
If I can just quickly add on to what Jim and Martha said about self-care. Totally agree. And I have a real life story. You know, you can give all the resources that you can possibly provide as an employer to your employees. You know, childcare, check. We had an example where, I'm sorry, I'm going to go back to the slime example. We had slime camp, you know, #1 camp. We had 3 kids from the US and, you know, 9 kids local. The child loved it. One day, one parent just had a meltdown on Zoom, and there was sudden silence because she just went like, I would always sit in quietly and listen. I trusted my daughter and her friend, but you know, I don't need to make slime for the 50 millionth time, but I'm sitting there listening. And then I heard this parent go ballistic, and she was yelling at another child in the background, but we all know that sound travels on Zoom. And it was so uncomfortable. It was so painful. I give it credit to, you know, everyone kind of like paused and then just went on to like, add your food color, add your sparkles. The moral of this story was no matter how much you can try to provide and tick off the boxes, we're going to have those days, and the passion and empathy are important because, you know, I think I always said that my mood is impacted by the sun, right? The sun, the tides, you name it. I have what I ate. This is like, you know, a whole nother thing. And I'm optimistic that it's actually going to end in January of 2022. I actually think, Jim, it's going to be a longer marathon than that timeline. But I appreciate your comment, Jim, about empathy and compassion, because I think that matters more than ever right now.
I mean, I want to bring up a topic because I think there's a word that's being thrown around that people have not heard ever. So my background is in accommodation. And I have never heard the word accommodation more than I have in the last 6 months, because when you request flexibility or you request whatever, it's a request for accommodation from your employer. That's the formal term, right? Like, I'm requesting a 3-day work week. I'm requesting, you know, time off for all my appointments. And the one thing I want to point out is, although like there's all these resources and whatever, accommodation is individual. So what you may come up with one employee will be totally different than what another employee is. And I tell this to employers because there's this sort of assumption from an employee that the employer will make it, like, will figure out the accommodation, right? Like, they're like, I'm stressed out, I don't know what to do. What are my options? And that's not how it works. It's a conversation. So both sides have to bring sort of what they need, what they're available for, what they can work on. Like, and it's supposed to be a moving, flexible thing. So I always tell people for accommodations, like really the longest an accommodation should go on for is like 3 months, because it needs to be reassessed. So what works for month 1 may no longer be necessary for month 2. What works for month 2 may be a new thing for month 3. But people request these accommodations, and then they're like, well, how long do you need this accommodation? And people say, well, forever. You're like, no, not forever, but like, you know, so it's only because people are using it all the time. Accommodation is actually a legal term. It's actually a legal term. So like there are certain requirements under the Human Rights Act, there's certain requirements like legally, but for where most people are with our like companies less than 50 people, accommodation doesn't need to be complicated, but it needs to be a conversation, and it can absolutely be different for every single person. Like that's how it should look. It shouldn't just be like, here's the options we're offering, plunk yourself into one of these.
Although, Allison, and maybe correct me if I'm wrong, right? So one thing that we've been also like gauging where people are at to support a conversation is we've been pretty much doing a survey out to our employees every 4 to 6 weeks. And we like over communicate. Someone told me recently that like someone just emailed them to say like it was time to come back to work. Everyone was expected back at their desk on September 14th. And it was my cousin, and she was like, what? And whereas like, you know, I talk regularly in my company stand up on Mondays, like what I'm thinking, where we're going, you know, how we're listening. And then before we finalize the policy, we do a survey to kind of just gauge where people are at. And we always have an open comment section where we ask us like, tell us how you're feeling. And it's like one of those things that's really interesting is that like I'm getting a lot of interesting input and honesty in that how are you feeling piece that again is not just like used blindly, but then is used to have a conversation to then follow up. And we aren't doing anything to gauge like how are they feeling over time, like, oh, it'd be amazing, but I'm a 20-person company, right? So it's like my Google form feedback where like the responses is hidden other than for myself and my leadership team, but it's creating that conversation so we can identify the type of accommodations that we need, and that we can also, you know, be empathetic and understand how those individual needs are different. And we've had like all kinds of things, right? So it's not just parents, and it's not just, it's mental health, but it's also could be mental health of their children or their spouse or their partner. Like there's so many like pieces. And I think as founders, we just like, how do we keep getting that information so we can have those conversations? And I guess the other piece is then actionable. It's like meet with your team regularly. Like this is the time that you want to be having those meetings with your video on and being present to them in a way that perhaps you haven't done before. Or I've even gone as far as like, I'm going to come to your house and we're going to do a distance walking meeting, right? Or we have a picnic with our team so that people could like start building community and we could define this new normal.
Right. And I think for me, the actual, so for accommodation, like other than being flexible and doing whatever, like a formal request for accommodation is actually a process. Like, so once you're given a request for accommodation, you have to deal with all the legalities, right? Like, so you have to show that you've responded to that request for accommodation, that this is the plan.
So it's more formal.
It's more formal because, and things are coming up. Because as much as we want to be open with our employees, like I'll be very honest, like my husband, he's going to love this, is not that person. Like his team didn't even know he was married until like I ended up in the hospital because he just doesn't want to, right? Like that's not who he is, and he doesn't feel comfortable sharing. Like I've known Sheri for years. I don't even think she's ever met my husband, right? Like it's oh yeah, you have. Okay, so she's like one of the very few. But like, so there's certain respect that like there will be quieter team members who you won't see coming until they fall. Right? Because they don't want to fill out the Google form, or they don't want to tell you that, both their kids are asthmatic because they don't want to, like for an employee during a pandemic, like opening your sleeve can be scary, right? Do you want your employer, like not every employer is you, right? Like, do you want your employer to know that you're struggling and have 3, sick grandparents at your house and like all these things? Like, so that's a bit of a touch. So I know that there's lots of employers here, but I'm like, you may not get that information. Or you may be getting what I call like fluff stuff, like filling out what they're supposed to be telling you, which is something that happens in HR terms, right? Like you have to look in deeper, and you seem to have great relationships with your people, but I work with organizations that do not, right? There is not that level of trust there.
And you have to, so we love surveys. So if anybody ever needs help doing surveys or getting the questions right, there is some science involved in how to do it well. There are really easy ways to do it yourself, but if you need help, reach out. But it still doesn't replace conversations. And you have to be really mindful, like in person, there is such a richness of information from seeing your team in real life. You can see if somebody's limping, right? Or if they've got a sore back or they look a little stiff. You know, you can really start to see if they, you know, they're showing the signs of maybe not taking care of themselves or their health is struggling a bit. And on Zoom, like, none of you know that I'm only wearing a Speedo right now, you know, but if I were in the office, you would know, and somebody would have fired me already today. So you have to take the time to ask. And Martha said earlier, like, you have to say, how are you doing? And then you have to say, really, like, how are you really doing? And even if, you know, you need to respect their privacy, obviously, and it's for them to decide how much they want to share, but you need to make that bridge available, that when it is time for them to need to share something, that they feel like they can bring it to you and get the flexibility or the formal accommodation that they need.
And it also means sharing first.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? Like my
Again,
whole team, right? Like my whole team has journeyed my Lyme journey with me because, you know, like that's my journey, right? And I want, you know, just like I want to support them, like I need them to support me sometimes on things. So again, you know, your advice of like, you have to be transparent about, you know, I actually have my walk like in my calendar now, and my team holds me accountable to it and asks me to go with them, like to try to get outside. Like there's, you know, it's also, you know, building that trust is also being open about yourself, right? And sort of sharing how you're doing. So when my team asks me how I'm doing, like I also tell them if I'm not doing great that day.
And until you've been a founder, nobody can empathize with a founder completely. And so they can only guess what you're going through. And so you have to be open with them to help improve the accuracy with which they can try to understand your point of view as well. And so again, that's that. It goes both directions, and it really comes down to leadership.
I wanted to ask if employees are struggling and they bring that to you know, their leader's attention, what responsibilities does a company have to help the employees with that? Anyone answer that?
What was the responsibility that the employer has?
Yeah, is there a responsibility that the employer has that goes beyond just asking the question, but if an employee shares with you that they are struggling?
Well, it's at that point, once you become fully aware that there is anything, that's when the responsibility actually starts to take a formal path. If there has been no explicit expression, you are not required to know or expected to know. And so when you ask, you are opening up the possibility to know something that you now do legally have to respond to. And I think we just have to trust, you know, I got goosebumps from that one, because we have to trust that you want to know and you're willing to walk that legal tightrope of formal HR law when it's required, when the situation validates that. Allison can probably speak more to it. And if as founders you haven't had experiences like this yet, they're coming. So you're better to figure out those pieces, because there are definitely behaviors that you have to put into place once that legal path starts.
Yeah, and I can just touch on that. So the one thing that we're getting a lot of is people are asking for, you know, CHRP came out, and so suddenly there were like all these leaves, right? Like, so in addition to if you didn't have short-term or long-term disability, there was sickness benefits and CHRP and all of these, and so employers, okay, I've been doing this for 20 years. I have never seen legislation move this fast in my whole life. It was like a part-time job. Me and another accountant who was just trying to keep up with the EI stuff. It was like daily. Every time they had a news conference, the only things we would get were like from the question and answers, they would give us more details. But sort of being prepared for that. If you have someone who comes for you and says, you know, I need a break or I need to take a couple of days off, you do have to sit down and ask them what they're asking for. Because what I'm seeing is a lot of panic. I can't do this. I'm feeling overwhelmed. I need a mental health leave. Can I get paid for that? Like, what are our options, right? Like, so it comes hard and quickly from like, I'm doing okay to like not doing okay. And like both of you said, if you're keeping sort of a pulse on what's going on, you can anticipate it. But people who don't, it will come out in sort of like a flood. And so you have to be ready with some of those answers. So I can put together some of the leaves that are available, because if you don't have short-term or paid sick leave, there are other options, you know, especially if someone gets quite sick, or if they're caring, you know, there's caregiver leave if you're caring for a sick family member. Like, the government offers those resources. It's not, as much as it's not actually the employer's job to like help them figure out EI benefits, right? Like, that's not your job. You know, they can call EI hotlines, and people get into trouble talking about things that they don't know, right? They say, yes, you can go off, you should apply for EI, we'll fill out all the forms for you, but then, you know, like they don't actually qualify, and then like it comes full circle. So the answer for employers should always be like, you know, we want to support you. We'll need to find out this information. You know, can you contact, you know, EI or get whatever, but, or find someone to help you if you don't have HR staff, right? Like, these can get really tricky. And it's only because there's so many options now, right? Like, they're just opening things up, and they're going to have, they're going to approve federal sick leave, right? 10 days of sick leave is the next thing is coming down. So that's my only warning, is like, watch out for those moments and find out what they really want. Do they just need a day? Do they need a week? Do they need a month? Like, what's really happening, and what do they sort of need? Because it's also really hard to get into the doctor right now, right?
Man, when you talk about that, it stresses me out as a founder, because I'm just like, what about my customers, right? Like, how am I going to plan those things? And so I'm constantly, I feel like I'm two-faced sometimes. I have like my empathetic human side, and then I have my like hard ass business side, and trying to like, you know, manage those two pieces to like, you know, do the right thing, right? For the business and for the person. One thing though that has come up for us recently is just like, how do we cross-train more so that, you know, or create opportunities for people to like review or collaborate on different work, so that we're, you know, I'll say softly preparing for should, you know, someone need that time off, or, and it's good business anyways, right? So like, if someone has a death in the family, has to be out for a week, or, you know, someone gets sick, or someone decides to go on vacation for a month, right? Like, it's, you know, it's sort of more likely to happen now in a more sort of, I'll say like, kind of higher occurrence type of rate. But it's, I'll say like a practical thing that we're doing that I think allows us to prepare for that without going, you know, without sort of getting too scared about it, but being like, okay, how do we just like, and we're doing simple things like code reviews, right? So that like, you know, everyone's aware of what code's being written. Or in my customer success team, we, you know, we're reviewing each other's work as just like a way to accelerate, you know, the deliverable to our client. Or we're, you know, having people review, you know, new processes that we're creating, right? So again, we're just creating it as a, like a more collaborative environment. One, it also then helps mental health because people have like a reason to get together and work together. So that's my like practical application of how you act on that, but in a sort of business way to not get us stressed out.
Right. And that also works well for sales, I think, right? Like if you have two people who are on that file, right? Like who are on that client, and one person goes and the other person's still there, like they don't see any difference, right? Like
the hard part is in small teams, right? Like, so we're 20, which would be considered a scale up, but still like, we're still only 20 people, right? So I think part of it's like, you know, practical, like I don't have two salespeople to put on it, right? So it's like, how do you do it that it's just, that even if you have 6 people on your team, that there's a way sort of to do a little bit of that.
So I think the parent, if they know that somebody else might not have a duplication, but can step in to bridge a gap, that gives us a sense of psychological safety. But also, if I introduce my peer to my customer to say, hey, given everything that's going on right now, if there's ever a day, you know, when all of a sudden I've got to race home, or I've got to deal with my kids given what's going on, here is Nate or Dave, and they're going to be able to take care of you in the short term. That also shows to your customers that you've thought through these different contingencies and you've got a plan in place. And so anytime we can create psychological safety a little bit more, we're helping everybody feel better about the what ifs that might occur. Even if you haven't shown them every contingency, the fact that you've shown them any consideration for contingency will help them believe that you have thought through this and you're not only going to be reacting.
Right. And HR teams do this naturally because all we do is contingency planning. So in every one of my emails, I always said, if I'm unavailable, contact Alexandra at extension 321. She'll be able to help you in the short term, right? Like from the day I start, that always is there. And you're right, it creates this sense of continuity and that you've planned for the situations where it's like, if Jim's unavailable, please contact Martha, like it's just short term, but it looks good from I feel good when like I contact someone and they're away on vacation, but someone else I have a contact name for, right?
Yeah, and let me interject real quick.
Yep.
Hug an HR person the next time you see them, or
Thank
send them a high five. Because oftentimes they are demonized because they have to walk these legal, tight ropes in these situations, but they care so deeply about people and they are absolutely doing their best, and they have been run ragged. They're like the equivalent of founders all across the world. So if you know somebody working in HR right now, send them a high five or tweet out a note of gratitude because they've been caring for everybody that they possibly can.
And we also can't talk about it.
Yeah.
Ever.
Christina, maybe a good piece, so finding HR help has been top of mind for me. Christina, I think I let you know that. So maybe Christina, you could talk a little bit about like the HR resources Communitech has, because I actually think that that's something that has been elevated in my list of priorities, where I perhaps have deprioritized HR previously, but it's now so important. Like it's made it really strategic in a company.
Yeah, absolutely. So we do have 2 growth coaches on the Start and Scale team, both with people and culture as their main area of expertise. And so if there are any founders on the call who need help in that area, please reach out to your Communitech CSM or advisor, and they can definitely connect you with those growth coaches. Thanks for bringing that up, Martha. I'll also kind of pause our conversation. We're almost at the top of the hour here, just to double check with the audience if there's any last minute burning questions that you have that we haven't touched on today that you're hoping to walk away from the session with. Please put them into chat now, and we'll get to them quickly here before 3 o'clock. While we're seeing if anything populates there, I'm going to open a little bit of a can of worms. The one topic we didn't touch on today was, part of the what we're seeing with parents and how they're handling this is we're seeing some moms and women leaving the workplace as a result of this whole piece. And so while we're seeing if anything comes up in the chat, I just wanted to give a moment to see if anyone on the panel wanted to touch on that topic of women. We've been struggling to see women in leadership roles, especially in tech, for a long time. And so what do we see and think about moms stepping away from their jobs right now?
Can't let that happen. We have to decide as a community to protect the 30, 50, 100 years that it's taken to get as far as we have. And so I'm very pro affirmative action. So we need to take additional steps to protect the different groups, of which moms are one group, who are being impacted differentially. And we need to be willing to do a little bit extra. And some of the things around the workplace flexibility, like I was speaking with my team who are parents, some of them, and I said, if it can't be 100% right now, we can do 75, we can do 50, we can do 30, but it doesn't need to be all or nothing. And opening up those conversations first to say, there might be a place that we can retreat to if that's required that isn't all the way home. And the whole reason why the government wanted to keep people employed, and so we ended up with shoes, is that once somebody is unemployed, the experience to get them employed again is very, very difficult, and the probability of success goes down. So we need to do everything that we can to keep people employed, even if it's fractionally or adjusted or differentially, so that we can dial that back up really quickly when they're ready. And ideally be giving them the arrangements and the flexibility that they need before they have to consider such drastic moves.
I think the big thing is we have to be creative too, right? So, I sort of was like, if school's not going out, like, how do I hire a teacher and like support the kids here, right? So those moms can keep working, right? So how do we as founders work together to identify some of those things that maybe is unaffordable or unpractical for one of us to do, but if we work together, we might be able to do. And I think the other critical part is just like having those conversations, right? So that it's not a surprise if someone's like, oh my goodness, like I just can't do this anymore. Like I'm just done, to be like, what does it look like to do fractional? Like what support do you need? Like what's, how do you just like use your network or your resources? And I know Community Tech, you're really passionate about this as well. Like hell no, we are not going back to the 1950s. And so, but it means, to Jim's point, we're going to have to work as a community to kind of identify ways that we make sure that that doesn't happen. And it means being creative, coming up with different solutions, working together. But first of all, understanding where those things are starting. And, I'm hiring. So if you want to come join my team, then feel free to give me a call.
I feel this is a totally unfair 3 o'clock answer because this is like what I do. This is all of what I do.
Oh, Allison.
is keeping moms employed in the workplace, and clearly like me and Jim need to sit down because like that it's making that very public statement, right? We are not going to, men, women, black, white, everybody, we are not going to let this happen. We recognize it's a problem. Because I'm lucky enough, I have a community of 5,000 working mothers, like in Ontario. And the things that are being said to them are disgusting, heartbreaking, horrible. Like I've been doing this for 20 years. I've never seen anything like it. But there are companies who are standing up and saying that we are not going to let this happen. You are important to us. Your contribution to us as a society is important. And just like it's important to put, your walk in your calendar, it's important to say these things out loud to anybody who's listening, right? Like out loud. And so I think that's the big first step. People are like, what can I do? I'm like, you have to start like thumping that drum really hard and being like, we are working together. We as a community are not going to let that happen.
Great. That's awesome. I want to, we are at 3 o'clock. So I want to say that this conversation will continue though at our Working Parents Peer-to-Peer. So for those of you who are on the call, we're going to continue on these topics. And so watch for more dates and information about that. We will have Allison and Sheri join us for that panel. So thank you to the panelists today, Martha, Allison, Jim, and Sheri, who had to jump off to pick up her kids from school. So thank you all for being here, for your time, for your passion. I really appreciate it. And thank you to the audience for joining us today. And we will follow up with all of the resources from today's call that Allison mentioned, that Jim shared. And yeah, stay safe, stay healthy everyone, and look forward to seeing you soon. Thanks everyone. Bye.